We know the Arab Spring isn't done yet. We know that countries that have been through regime change aren't particularly stable. We may all feel a lot better now that Libya, with its, 1.7, 1.8 million barrels of very pure oil, is about to come back on stream. But what about everywhere else? I was trying to think of an example to give you of some region of the world that might explode next. Spoilt for choice, really. But I got a note through about Algeria, about which I know very little. Any Arabists in the room? I think there is actually an Arabist in the room. Algeria has had a pretty woeful history. Independence came in the early 60s. After that, it had a pile of presidents, 3 in a row, distinguished from each other only by their differing degrees of brutality. Free elections, 1991. The Islamic Salvation Front won. No one was particularly into that, so the result was overturned. And a nice man from the army took the job. After that, another nice man from the army took the job, and he's still in place. He regularly wins elections with somewhere between 80 and 90% of the vote, something that would make your old-style Stalinist politicians blush rather, but he doesn't blush. Now he controls the executive, he controls the military, he controls the state oil company, and not in a very nice way. Amnesty International were banned a long time ago. All his neighbors hate him. Suicide bombings are on the up, civil unrest all over the place, and he's 74 years old and has no obvious heirs. You might think it doesn't matter. After all, they're only churning out a couple of million barrels of oil a day. It's not pure like Libya's. But it matters, partly because it matters, but it also matters because Algeria is the 6th largest natural gas producer in the world. In Europe, it's 3rd only to Russia and to Norway. Its pipeline crossroad is the biggest single gas hub in Europe. So if Algeria sees some kind of regime change, and it looks pretty likely, you know, you've got an old guy who no one particularly likes, no obvious heir, an irritable military, and freedom riots knocking on every border. If it sees a messy regime change, oil prices will soar, but in particular, gas prices will soar. Then UK inflation will also soar. Energy markets are very, very, very vulnerable. And when energy prices rise, it doesn't matter how deflationary the environment around us is, consumer inflation will also rise. My point with this is just to say that we don't live in a stable political environment. We sort of think we do, because we're so used to living in one. You know, until very recently, we lived in a long, long period of peace. We don't live in that anymore. Look around you, and you'll see that pretty much everywhere there are huge numbers of demonstrations, rising numbers of demonstrations. Here, across Europe, Israel, all over the Middle East, China. You know, there should be no surprise there that the Great Recession, the Great Depression, the credit crunch, whatever you like to call it, the long stagflation, what it's doing is it's bringing all the problems of the globe to the fore. It's reminding us that inequality is rising. It's reminding us that incomes are falling. And worst of all, what it's doing for a great many countries is making their populations think that their opportunities are diminished. Now, this really matters. You know, people will put up with all sorts of things as long as they think that the future will be better than the past. So if you work in a factory in China, 5 years ago, you might have been absolutely convinced that your wages would go up fast, that your quality of living would improve, and that it was worth it, worth working for very little now because the future is so bright. You might not feel like that today. And that's why wages are rising so fast in China. And that's another thing that is feeding into our consumer price inflation. It's also why a lot of production in China is moving to Bangladesh. Now, one of the reasons that inflation rose so fast post-crisis across the world was because our supply chain became very fractured. No one could move the things they wanted from one place to another place. It became impossible to get a credit letter. Everyone was so worried about everyone's credit that it became very hard to move anything around the place. A lot of companies didn't make it through that. The deflationists will tell you that because a lot of companies didn't make it through, we have a lot of spare capacity in our economies. We have a big output gap. There's lots of space to expand into. Might be true, might not be true. But I suspect that what we've seen is a semi-permanent contraction of capacity. If you think about it in terms of, I don't know, a restaurant in Guildford. Maybe not Guildford, people are too rich in Guildford. Truro. Think about it in terms of a restaurant in Truro. At the beginning of the credit crunch, its credit lines were cut. It goes bust. You've got an empty shop front on the high street. Now, you might think that's spare capacity, but it's not. It's not spare capacity because it can't be used, because nobody can start a new business there, and they can't start a new business there because of the banking crisis. They can't start a new business because nobody will lend them the money to do so. So while from a distance it looks like spare capacity, it's actually not. It's removed capacity. It's been taken out of the supply chain, and it's going to stay out of the supply chain until the banking crisis is over, until we have a renewed banking system, which, by the way, our politicians are behaving as something that is a very, very long way away. So this is an argument that I think we have to be quite careful of. We have a lot of unemployed people, we have a lot of empty buildings, we have a lot of what looks like spare capacity, but if you actually try and use it, you'll find it's not spare capacity at all.